I want to look at not the whole life of Daniel, but several passages that talked about situations he was in that I was really impressed with. I did some reading this week. My work's been kind of slow, so it gave me a lot more time to do some more reading and more praying about it. And so I want to look at that tonight. Come on in, guys. Come on in. I want us to put ourselves in the shoes of Daniel. Pretend, what would it be like for you to be taken from your homeland, to be exiled to a pagan nation, to have to work for a pagan king, to have to leave your family behind, your culture behind, your language behind, all of it behind. And you're literally starting over. And you're not even 20 years old yet. Can anybody relate to that? I really can't do it. In the first chapter of Daniel, God mentions that he's going to let Nebuchadnezzar have his way with his people. And he's going to take them into captivity. And he's going to take some of the men from his court. And I believe it's, let's see, verse 3 and 4. The king ordered, I don't know how you say the guy's name, Aspenaz or whatever, the chief of the officials to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and the nobles. Youths in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So imagine what that would be like, having to learn something you don't really want to learn. I never learned English very well, as you can tell. Okay? My dad used to have this uncanny way of correcting me in front of all my brothers and sisters at the dinner table when I would speak terrible English. He was a very good English-speaking person. Me, I never learned it. But could you imagine learning another foreign language like that? So he mentions all the qualifications that he wants of these people. These kings would take these youths and they would groom them for their court. The only example I have of somebody like this going through something even remotely connected to this situation would be my daughter-in-law Roxy. When she came from Romania and she went to Florida College when she was 18, she didn't know English. I didn't even know that. When I met her, I didn't know that when she came here, she knew no English whatsoever. Couldn't speak it. And she was able, over a period of a couple of years, to be able to learn it. And now when you hear her talk, it's pretty amazing, the transformation, how you wouldn't know that she didn't know it, you know. And she had to leave her family behind, she had to leave her culture behind, and everything that she knew. Oh, here. Oh, you put it up there already? Thank you. You gave it to him? Oh, no, here, I'll give it to him here. Or I'll just set it up here and let him come back and get it. He'll get it later. I don't like taking attendance. So I want you to think about that, what it would be like for that. So these young people were put under a lot of pressure. One of the things that Daniel had to do, and his friends, his three friends that came with him, was they had to go to school for 3 years. They had to get educated in all the wisdom and the literature of the Chaldeans and the Babylonians. And I want you to think what that would be like. And if they didn't learn it, and they weren't going to be successful in learning all of that, he would get rid of these people. He would just wipe them out and go find somebody else to train. Okay? I think that would scare me to death. I think I'd have been one of the guys that didn't make it, you know, through the 3 years, and I ended up, we know you're not going to make it. So I think that's something to think about. In the New Testament, when you think about being a Christian, a young Christian in their youth, I think about Timothy. And Paul had to admonish Timothy a little bit. Over in 1 Timothy 4:12, I want you to listen to this for a second. 1 Timothy 4:12. And he was a young preacher. I hope I got the right verse. Okay. Let no one look down upon your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself an example of those who believe. Do you think it would have been, and remember, Daniel and his young boys, they were heavily taught the law of Moses, so they had that training as well. Do you think it was easy for them to learn something like what the Chaldeans taught that was contradictory to what they had been taught under the law of Moses? Do you think it was easy for them to reconcile those two things? Do you think that'd be easy to do? And if they were to speak up about it, do you think they'd get any flack for it? I think they would. I think they would. So they sort of had to go along with that, even if they didn't agree with it. That would be hard. Do y'all remember, we talked about the youth, and I think it was in Paducah, Kentucky, back in the early 90s. In a high school, there was a gunman that came to the school, and I don't know if I got the right place, but they were having either some kind of Bible study or doing something at school on school property, and a guy took a gun out and shot one of the girls in that group. And before he shot her, he asked her the question, "Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God?" And she said yes. And he shot her. Just shot her dead, just like that. We hear about things like that, but I don't know if we relate to any of those things. But I know in the world today, across other countries, across the globe, you have a lot of people that are being challenged in their faith like that. And I think these guys were challenged in their faith as well. So, you know, as a parent, we all have a desire to want to protect our kids from bad things, if we can. You know, and I get that. I understand that. But sometimes we take that protection so much so that we don't help them prepare on how to deal with hard situations. So when a hard situation comes up, they don't know what to do. And sometimes their faith becomes weak and they give in. I don't think it's going to get any better anytime soon in America with this situation, with Christians being persecuted and human wisdom trying to take center stage and try to blot out the Bible and all of that stands for. So, let's see. One of the things that Daniel did good in his situation here that I thought was really good was he surrounded himself with other people like himself. His friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were his closest friends. And he understood, I think, the importance of having that connection to his friends that believed like he did. It allowed him to be able to deal with some of the peer pressure. After these guys finished their 3 years of training, they would go and have to work in the king's court. Now, I don't know about you, but a high government official job like that I think would be very stressful, especially with the king watching. And if you're a young person, or maybe not young, but older, but you're in a court and you're a Jew and you're around all these non-Jews and they don't like you, and they've made it very clear they don't like you, okay? Do you think that'd be an easy work situation for them every day? And realize they didn't have a way out here. They couldn't say, "You know what, King, I don't like my job anymore. Give me something else to do that's easier so I don't have to deal with all of this high pressure." Most of us want to back off from that, wouldn't we? It's like, I can only take it so long, and then when it's over, and I'm getting out. Well, where could they go? They were exiled. They didn't even have their own freedom. The king wasn't going to let him just take these guys and let them run loose. So they had to have a very strong faith in God. And it had to be able to overcome these obstacles that they'd face every single day. I can't imagine. I wish they'd talked more about the pressure they were under. But I want to look at 3 other situations that I think they found themselves in. Before I go there, I want to say Daniel relied on God in prayer as a true source of strength. He knew that only God had the answers to things. One of the things that God gave them that was so good, the wisdom he gave these guys, it said, was 10 times better than any of the wisdom that any of the other people in the court had. So when you pray to God for wisdom, Pray big and pray expecting God to give you more than what you need. He gave these guys so much that was such a contrast between their knowledge and all the rest of them that they wanted to take these guys and elevate them to the very top of the kingdom because they had this wisdom and they knew where it came from. In chapter 2, verse 27 and 28, Daniel was being asked about the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And he wouldn't tell him what the dream was, and he didn't know the interpretation. So he asked his wise men to come in and tell him what was the dream I had, and then you give me the interpretation. And if you don't, I'm killing you. Okay? I've never been in that situation ever before. I mean, I've been in situations where they're going to fire me. That's not the same as being put to death. Listen to Daniel. Daniel answered before the king and said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while you were on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turned to what would take place in the future, and he who revealed mysteries has made known to you what will take place. So he's answered the first part of the question. He knows what the dream was. That's very impressive. I would be impressed if I was the king and he told me this. And then he goes on and tells him the interpretation of the dream. And he realized he didn't have that. That was something God gave him. Okay? And the point for us, I would think, is if we're being given gifts by God, we should use them to glorify him. We should tell him thank you for the gifts. If he equips us with a certain type of talent, don't bury it in the sand. Pretend you don't have it. Use it. But remember, gifts are on loan from God while we're here, just for a little while. And when it's all over, they're gone. Okay? Anybody got any questions or comments about that? After this situation now, I'm sorry. What? I didn't look up, sorry.
I know.
I'm sorry. I was ready to go.
No, I was just going to say it was impressive to me that they talk about them being very young men and the fact that in their youth they seemed to be very connected to God and they prayed to God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's not true of every youth, but a lot of times we do find that when you're younger, you don't have as strong of a connection to God, and that's something you grow into and things like that. So the fact that they were young and they were in that position, I thought was really good. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. Brian?
Yeah, it's interesting too. As Christians, I think about the parallel. Like we're in a foreign land in the sense that the people around us don't speak our language. They don't speak godly language, about spiritual things. They're talking about all kinds of different things. Even viewing us with some hostility and trying to indoctrinate us, trying to bring their philosophy into our minds and our hearts and change our name, to be like them. And so I think that prayer is this very centering anchor, kind of a privilege that we have, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but to keep us grounded and to keep us from allowing the world to influence us and infiltrate our hearts. And instead, we become the ones, like Daniel and his friends, that start to infiltrate and to influence those around them.
All right. Great comment. I agree with it 100%. The other day we were talking about Paul's thorn in the flesh, and I didn't get to answer this. And we talked about the end game of what God was trying to accomplish with Paul and with all of his people. And that was that in our weakness, the power of Christ would be present. And with that power present in our life, it would give, number one, what we don't have within ourselves, the presence of God. It would give us that transforming power to change our hearts. But then that light would shine out and emanate from us to reflect to a lost world. And we didn't get to talk about that. For we do not, this is 2 Corinthians 4, 5 through 10. For we do not preach ourselves but Christ, Jesus is Lord, and ourselves as only bondservants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, is the one who shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. Okay? But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God and not from ourselves. And now listen to the contrast. He's contrasting the weakness of man that Paul had and that I have and that you have with the power of God and what that power can do versus our weakness that can't do it. He says we're afflicted in every way, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not despairing. We're persecuted, but we're not forsaken. We're struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying about in the body of Christ the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Christ also may be manifest in our bodies. Listen to that. The death of Christ and the life of Christ is at work. The death of Christ is helping us to put to death the old man. The life of Christ and the glory of God is there to try to raise up that new man in Christ. That is beautiful. See, God is not limited by our weaknesses. God's power has nothing to do with how weak we are. But in prayer, when we lift our hearts up to God, and that presence of his light, that's what he's talking about when he says light shining into darkness. His light, just like in John 1, where the light came into the world and darkness loved the dark. They loved the darkness rather than the light. Wouldn't let that light come in. That's exactly what was going on here. So Daniel and his three friends represent this. They recognized that in spite of every advantage that they had been given at home, they took that advantage and used it in their situation in such a way that they rose above the crowd, as Brian would say. They didn't blend in. They stood out. And that's what he wants. And that's what I think a lot of... I will say this. This has been one of my pet peeves my whole life, from the time I was baptized until today. When we teach the gospel to people and ask them to believe and be baptized, that's a starting point, not an end point. Now what God is doing when we enter into Christ and we are buried into him, God now is wanting to do this in us. He's wanting a relationship with us where he takes center stage, not us. He wants to show us that you don't focus on your weaknesses, you focus on my manifest presence in your life, and that's going to be the power you can draw from so you can face any temptation and any hardship that you're going to face. So situation number 2, Daniel interprets the dream. He's promoted over the kingdom. He's chief over all the wise men. And he didn't forget his friends. He remembered his friends. Isn't that great? He understood the value of that. So he kept his friends, and they were elevated with him as well, but not the same place exactly. They were just a little bit under him. That was the second situation. I don't have much more to say about that. Anybody want to comment on that? I mean, if you're a Jew and you're living in this pagan king's court, they had to stick out like a sore thumb. You know, these other guys that weren't Jewish, you know, they hated that. They hated that. They wanted to be the ones at the top. Situation number 3, the king makes a golden image and he wants everybody to bow down to it. We all know the story. Look at these guys that have just been elevated to the highest position in the kingdom. Okay? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not want to bow down to this idol or this image. It was very common for pagan kings to build images of themselves, physical form, idol, whatever you want to call it, and then get people to bow down to it. They like their ego to be stroked. Okay? Kings love that. And I want you to listen to what they said in Daniel 3, 17 through 18 about this. You don't refuse the king and not have to pay for it. Okay? Listen to their response to their king. Now remember, there's fear of death by the king, and then there's that fear of God we should have to do what's right, even in the face of death. Okay? Shadrach, Meshach, verse 16. Let me read 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up." Imagine standing in front of the king saying that, knowing that you're going to go in that furnace. They knew they were going in that furnace. This was not a hypothetical thing for them. This was as real as it gets. It's like a guy holding a gun to your head. Okay? I have one of those stories, but I'm not going to share that tonight. So you just think about that. Let that settle. Put yourself in the shoes of these three guys. How would you feel? Would you feel glad that you stood up and said that to the king? Would you be looking forward to being put in there? In that fire? He said the king was so mad at these guys, he heated the thing up 7 times hotter than it normally gets. He took all the guys in their fancy robes and all their fancy clothes, the ones that made them look really important in the king's court, because a lot of that material was very flammable. So when you stick it in the fire, it's going to poof real fast, and all of a sudden, the fireworks start. They tie all these guys together so they can't get out. And the guys that put him in the fire die because the heat's so bad. Okay? And then the king's standing there and he can't believe it. He sees 4 people in that fire. Now, if I wasn't a believing person and I wasn't a Christian, I'd almost say this has got to be a story. This can't be real. This just can't be real. Okay? But it was. If Daniel was here today, he'd tell you. If these guys were here today, they'd tell you. It was very real. I'm thankful I don't have to go into a fiery furnace. Although, when I go out here in Florida sometime in the middle of summer, it feels like a hot thing. It does. But they refused to bow. I think these guys understood what being a Christian or being a believer in God was really all about. They took it to the ultimate test. It said when they came out of that fire, didn't even have the smell of smoke on them. They smelled just the same as they did before they walked in. Nothing happened to them. Now, if you were the king, what would you say to these guys when they come out? What would you say? Because you're the one that put them in there. You expect them to be burned up. This king now has become aware of something he didn't realize. There's someone bigger than he is. That furnace represented the most he could do to those guys. And yet, that wasn't enough. There was a king that could save them out of that. That's the king, that's the God we serve. Okay. Any questions? Aren't you glad that's not your test today? I'd like to think I'd pass the test. But you know what? I don't know. I don't know. I want to say yes, I would. But I don't know. That's pretty rough. You know?
I was going to say, a lot of times we're in situations where, especially when we were younger, that we didn't want to be made fun of just for being a Christian. And we would back away from things sometimes maybe because we didn't want somebody to laugh, "Oh, you're going to church again?" We would hear that a lot of times. And, you'd feel a little bit funny about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yet you take that and compare it to them going into a furnace. It should make us feel pretty low that we're not able to stand up any more than that.
That's right. Anybody else? These stories are real, and they should give us courage, a lot more than we have, to go out in the world and really shine for Him. And I'll be the first to say I'll be the first to say I struggled with it too when I was a kid. All right, situation number 4, chapter 6. This is the one everybody knows. This is the one they teach your little kids in the class. I often wonder when the little kids hear this story and, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, what's really going on in their mind when they hear the story about Daniel and the lion's den, And do they really think it's real? I never ask a little kid, do you think that was real? Do you think that really happened? I don't know. I'm not even sure if I believed it when I was 5 years old, But it's in there. It's God's word, so it has to be true. So now we got a different king. Nebuchadnezzar's gone. Darius is in play, and he's making some moves. Daniel now, he's one of the top 3 commissioners over everybody. All right, so in verse 1 it says, it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom. And over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Verse 3 is important. Again, think about what's happened with Nebuchadnezzar and him, with his friends and all that. Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Who does that remind you of back in the book of Genesis? Joseph. Yeah, Joseph. This guy is so gifted by God in such an extraordinary, beyond human way that this guy recognizes it, and he's going to do something about it. Do you think his other commissioners like that? I don't think so. Now look at verse 4. This is really important. We all have enemies. Usually the higher up you get promoted, the more enemies you get. It's just the way it works. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and not negligent, nor corruption was found in him. I want you to think about that for a minute. His enemies knew who the real Daniel was, and they hated him for it. They hated him for it. You got any people like that hate you for something you have they don't have? So these guys are looking for something legally they can use to nail this guy, and they can't find anything. What do they do now? What do people do today if they don't have anything to nail you with? What do they do? What do they do in politics? They'll lie. They'll just throw anything on the wall and hope it sticks so people will listen to it and believe it. Okay? These guys knew Daniel. He was as clean can be. So, even when and look, he's trying to live the right kind of life. You would think, okay, you've tested him all this time up until now. Why are you giving him this test now? Why can't you back off a little bit and let him enjoy his position of power for a little while? Instead, these guys want to come after him. Okay? So, they try to come up with something, but they can't. So what do?
Set a trap.
Yeah, they set a trap. What was the trap they set? You remember, you guys?
Can't pray.
Yeah, you can't pray for 30 days. Really? Well, they could pray as long as it was to the king, but they couldn't pray to their God. Okay? Isn't it ironic? The very strength that he shows, they had to attack because they had no weak spot on him they could get him with. There was no weakness in him that they could use against him. His strengths in their eyes were the weakness they were going to use to try to undermine him. That's, I'm like, wow, it's bad enough if you're weak and you got something against you, but this guy was so clean, they didn't even want to lie about him. They just decided to set this thing up against him. And it was for one purpose, and that was to get him out of there. They did not want Daniel there in that court. Now, I don't know if it was because of pure jealousy that they didn't want him in there, or if it was something else. But to go to the lengths that they did, I mean, your enemies, if they really don't want you in there, they're going to find a way to get you out. Okay? So, they get Darius to sign this little injunction. You cannot pray to your God for 30 days. And evidently, Daniel didn't know anything about it till after it was done. He didn't know that the other were going to come to the king and get him to sign this paper. So when he found out, down in verse 10, when he found out, it said, when he knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open towards Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. I think the reason this story impresses me so much when we talk about prayer is obviously Daniel was under a lot of pressure, internally and externally, to hold his character in place on one hand, and secondly, not to let the corrupt people he was working with in his king's court have their way with him and destroy him morally. And it said he did this 3 times a day. I don't know about you, but isn't once enough? Once a day, isn't that enough? Maybe twice, but 3 times a day? I scratch my head and go, wow. Was he praying the same prayer 3 times a day? Did he have the same structure of prayer every single time he got up there and did that 3 times? You know, what was that like? I sort of wish he had given us what that was, you know, what he was praying. But obviously, we know that when he needed help, he knew who to go to. And he always saw himself in this prayer relationship as the one who could look to God for the answers, for everything. Okay? And I think if I could share with you the greatest thing you could do in your life to get closer to God is pray to him. You can read your Bible, you'll get close to the Word, you'll get close to the ideas, but you're still one step removed from the actual person. I would recommend you spend as much... I used to say to Jack Frost years ago when he did a class on prayer, I said, look, I agree with you. If you're going to read the Word, great. I said, then spend the same amount of time on your knees as you do in the book. Balance that out a little bit so you don't become all Word and no prayer or no connection. This connection is what got him through. It wasn't just a proposition that he believed in. It was a God who was very real to him. It was a God who was as close to him as his breath was to him, as his spirit was to him. He recognized that. And that's what made him great. And that's what will make us great. So the king had to do what he did. He puts him in the lion's den. Okay? He put him in there. And what happened? We all know, right? What happened? Think about that. The king didn't want to do it. He was distressed. He was trying to find any way out to keep Daniel from going in there, but he couldn't do it because he signed that piece of paper. Be careful what you sign. Hey, we'll come back to bite you someday. But imagine, and it said the king was upset all night. He didn't eat. He didn't have entertainment. He didn't do anything. He couldn't wait till the next morning because he wanted to come down and see what was going to happen. Isn't it great? It was a story that ended very well. And the guys that wanted to get him in the lion's den ended up getting put in there. And they didn't come out alive. They crushed him to death. Okay? Has there ever been a time in your life where you felt the pressure of life so much that you didn't pray? Prayer should be the first response. To me, it should. If you're a Christian, it should be the first response you have when you're in trouble. Pray. I think you go to the Word, but as you're going to the Word, you better pray and ask God to help you with this. Because if you're like me, I can have knowledge, but if I don't have understanding and I don't have wisdom, all the words and all the knowledge is not going to help me. Daniel knew that, and he knew that he didn't have the wisdom unless God gave it to him. So it said that when Daniel was praying, the king said that in that act of praying, he called it continual service to God. He was continually serving God. I never looked at prayer as serving God. It was always talking to God. But I thought that was interesting the way he looked at that. He was serving God in his prayer life. We only come together and assemble once or twice a week. But he was praying and connecting to his God 3 times a day. So there must have been a lot there going on. Anybody else got any questions? We got a few minutes left.
Yes. So I think it's amazing he continued praying even when it was made illegal.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, would I pray if it was made illegal in Altamonte or Longwood or, this area? And I could say, yes, of course I would. But then it's like, but it's not illegal, and sometimes I don't pray. So it's like,
Okay, so
kind of a shame, right? That
yes.
I didn't even let that stop him from prayer, but I'll let busyness or headaches or distractions, stop me.
Yes. Gail?
He also did not close all of his windows and say, well, I'll pray, but I'm going to
Hide it. Yeah.
He did the same thing he did every time with the windows open, looking towards Jerusalem, which showed his faith as well.
I can bring this up now because it's been 2 or 3 years, but when COVID hit, remember what they told us we could or couldn't do? We couldn't assemble, right? In Seminole County, there was a law that said you can't do that. We might want to revisit that next time. We might want to rethink
They didn't
that.
say we couldn't.
Oh, didn't?
No, they regulated how many people could be in the building.
Okay.
They never actually said you can't assemble.
All right.
Wasn't there a preacher that was arrested?
California. Not here.
So we might end up having times like this in other countries. I'm sure they have it already. They've got the persecution already going on. But we know our government today in America is not a God-fearing nation as far as the government itself, the institution itself. So we might be challenged before too long. Thank you.